The auctioneer dropped the gavel at $40, and the loudest man on the lot laughed at him in front of the whole crowd. Emmett Coyle did not laugh back. He just lowered his hand, the bid already his, and looked up at what he had bought, a great dead heap of black iron standing off by itself against the fence at the edge of the salvage lot, a massive blacksmith's power hammer. Its towering cast frame gone black with grime over a squat heavy anvil, the flywheel seized, and the ram dead in its ways. The whole monster 500 pounds of cold iron and silent, hauled out of the guts of a torn-down one-man forge and left where the wrecking crew dropped it. The demolition men had pulled it from a smithy they were leveling and shoved it to the far fence. And 100 pickers had walked past it as too heavy to move and too filthy to bother with, so plainly dead the crowd read it as nothing but scrap iron and a bad back. Emmett had just paid $40 to own it, seized flywheel and dead ram and half a ton of grime and all. It was a bright, clear Saturday morning, the kind of hard light that comes off a gravel yard at the end of summer. At a demolition and estate salvage sale in the fenced lot of a wrecking company on the edge of a small county town. Emmett was 74 years old, lean and a little stooped now but sure in the hands, with a deeply lined face, gone soft and weathered, close-cropped white hair under a flat cap, wire spectacles pushed up his nose, and pale, patient eyes that took their time. His hands were broad and careful, the fingers still steady the way a man stays steady when he has spent a life setting heavy things right. He had worked that trade in his young years, a millwright and a forge hand, the one the drop shops and the smithies sent for when a power hammer's ram went dead or a toggle sprung, the one who could bring a dead striker back to life under the belt. Until the small forges closed and the hand trade went the way of the cheap imported steel that starved it, and the old men who could set a hammer by feel were quietly closed out. He had made his living since as a picker and a junk man, but the iron never left him. The man who laughed was Vernon Kellett, who ran the biggest salvage and scrap yard in 3 counties. A heavy-set man of about 55 in a loud Kelly green windbreaker he wore to be seen in, his face clean-shaven and ruddy, a thick gold ring on one hand and a stub of a cigar in the other. $40, Vern said, loud, so the whole lot could hear it. $40 for a busted hammer that don't even strike, junk man. The flywheel seized, the ram's dead, the belt's rotted, and the whole heap's dead weight. Takes 6 men and a crane just to tip it. Nobody's had one of these iron monsters land a blow in 50 years. You can't run it, you can't sell it, and you can't hardly move it. You didn't buy a hammer, old-timer, you bought half a ton of pig iron, and you paid $40 to haul it home when I'd have run the whole thing through the crusher and paid you for the weight. He coined the name right there, loud enough to carry the old man's iron headstone, and it stuck for the rest of that month, because a tall black frame standing dead over a squat anvil did look like nothing so much as a great iron gravestone. The crowd laughed because Vern laughed, the way a crowd does. Emmett stood through it without a change in his face, his hands folded quiet in front of him, and let the laughter pass, the way weather passes a man who has decided to stand in it. Now, if you have ever watched a quiet, capable man get talked over by a loud one, if you have ever known somebody whose skill the world used when it needed something and forgot the rest of the time, then you already understand what this channel is about, and you might take a second to subscribe. Because the people who stay for stories like Emmett's are who Iron Hook Stories was built for. Emmett said nothing. He had learned a long time ago that work does not answer to noise. What Vernon Kellett could not have known, grinning behind his cigar, was that Emmett had stood in front of that dead monster with a lifetime of the forge trade awake in him. The crowd saw a filthy heap against a fence. Emmett saw the machine. Under the grime, the frame cast heavy and true by a real hand. The ways dovetailed clean, and the toggle arms cut finer than any ordinary hammer ever needed. The anvil and saw block massive and dead square. The whole build finished with a care no factory line ever bothered with. This was a builder's, not a catalog machine knocked out by the hundred. Above all, he knew that a proud old hammer builder who made a thing like this almost always cast his own name into the frame where the rust would swallow it, and that a careful smith kept the maker's papers in the belly of the machine where no stranger would ever reach. Emmett knew the difference between a scrap hammer and a great one somebody had let die. And what he found that night would strike a forgotten name, and the record of the forge that hammer had beaten in back into a history that had struck them both out. Emmett had come up hard. He went into the shops young, apprenticed to an old millwright, learning the frames and the toggles and the long, patient feel of a machine until a dead ram came alive and struck true and square under the hand. His wife Cora had died after a long illness, and they had buried no family of their own, and after she was gone he lived alone in a small house behind his old shed with his rows of tools and his quiet. The town had a use for his hauling and no use at all for his hands. He knew that. A man who had set the motion of 100 great hammers could no more walk past a builder's hammer going for scrap than walk past his own past. So he bid, because he had seen that somebody built it to hold the thing that mattered most. If you've made it this far into Emmett Coyle's story, hit subscribe, because what happens next is the part I've been waiting to tell you. He let them sell the rest of the salvage first, the anvils and the leg vises and the boxed forge tools knocked down to the pickers, while Emmett waited by the fence beside the towering dead hammer. When the auctioneer finally came to it and called for a bid, Vern glanced up, called out his joke, and not one other hand went up. Emmett raised one finger, and the gavel came down at $40. He paid cash, signed the slip, and arranged to bring a flatbed and a crew around at the end of the day, because a power hammer was a killing thing to move whole. The story got around the town before Emmett's trailer was off the county road. By Monday, people who had not spoken 20 words to him in years stopped him outside the filling station to ask, grinning, whether he was going to stand his headstone up in the yard and carve his own name on it to get his $40 back. Harv Lundy, who ran the co-op counter, said it plainer, that there was nothing to a dead power hammer but rust and a hernia and no work left alive in it to raise. Emmett was buying a case of penetrating oil, a set of fine files and scrapers, and a box of clean rag, and did not look up. "We'll see," he said, and that was the whole of his answer. He had spent a life learning that a machine is either a maker's or it isn't, and the noise a crowd makes has nothing to do with which. But Emmett did not open the hammer up in the daylight, with the picker's truck still on the lot and Vern holding court by the auction table. He waited until the place had emptied out and he had the great machine home, craned down off the trailer and stood square in his shed under a single work lamp, and went at it alone that night after the town had gone quiet. He did not tear into it. He knew that a machine like this keeps its truth deep in the iron, and that you reach those places slowly, the way you reach into anything a careful hand once closed up. He wiped the grime back off the frame a hand's width at a time and worked the seized flywheel loose until it turned, and freed the dead ram until the motion moved again under his hand. And when he ran his palm down the face of the frame below the ram, he stopped, because there was a raised shape in the casting under the filth that was not the rough scale of foundry leaves where no eye falls, and low on the hollow base a bolted cover plate met the iron with a fit and a finish that made no sense, unless it was holding what lay behind it. Down at the filling station they were still asking if he had sold his headstone for the weight yet. Emmett wiped the raised shape clean with his thumb and began to back out the bolts on the cover plate that shut the belly of the machine where the world would never look. The hammer had its own long, hard history, and the town had let it go for scrap without once asking after it. It ran back to the man who built it, a self-taught American hammer builder of no fame in his own time, named Elias Roan, who had learned the frame and forge trade alone in a river iron town shop in an age when the big machine tool houses already had the factories sewn up. And it ran back to the one forge that hammer was built to beat in, the Fell Forge, a one-man smithy in a hard-luck county, whose smith had ordered this great machine for the shop he meant to work a lifetime. Roan built and finished it far beyond any ordinary order, because he meant once to build the best thing he was capable of. But the small forges went under in the hard years when cheap imported steel emptied the hand trade, and Roan's own works was wound up so completely that his very name was struck from the trade's register. And the hammer stood on in that forge until the shop was condemned and torn down and the machine hauled off 2 generations from where it was cast, no one remembering that a great builder had made it or that a working smith had beaten out honest iron under it. And tucked in the belly of the machine behind the cover plate, wrapped in oilcloth, lay Roan's own original foundry ledger page and the shipping bill for this exact hammer, folded in with a bundle of letters and a worn forge day book kept by the last man who ran it, a smith named Ambrose Fell, whose forge the county condemned and tore down, and whose name the rolls struck out along with the shops, so that the man who had beaten honest iron under that hammer for 40 years was the one most thoroughly erased. The maker himself died poor and unknown, his finest work sealed up around a dead forge's own papers and a struck-out smith's own hand. What none of them ever asked was what becomes of the record a dying forge trusts to its hammer, and the name of the man who swung it when both the shop and the maker are forgotten. The answer had been leaning against a salvage fence the whole time, shut in the belly of a $40 hammer nobody wanted. Emmett got the cover plate off a little after midnight, the last bolt backed out, and in the iron dark of the base sat an oilcloth bundle a stranger would have passed 1,000 times and never felt. He drew it out, and the old wrapping came open with a soft, dry crackle a lifetime in the waiting, and he laid it open under the lamp. There was a heavy foundry ledger sheet going amber with age, and folded around it a thick bundle of letters and a worn day book. Emmett lifted them out, and when he had the ledger sheet open and read the fine, sure hand that had ruled and entered every line of it, he set it down and stood very still. This was the maker's own foundry record, the builder's private account of every machine he ever cast and shipped, each one numbered and named in his hand, and this hammer's own entry stood there in the column, its work's number and the name of the forge it was built for entered plain, and folded with it was the shipping bill for this exact machine. The crated frame and ram and anvil billed out by rail to the Fell Forge the year it was set, and the letters and the day book, in another blunt, careful hand, were Ambrose Fell's, the smith writing to Roan the season he bought the hammer new and swore he would work it honest, and 40 years on, a forged day book kept to the week, the county came to condemn the shop. A working man setting down the plain truth of what his forge had been in a town about to forget he had ever raised a hammer in it, but the papers in the day book were only half of it. Emmett went back to the frame now, drawing the small lamp in close along the casting below the ram, and there, cast proud into the iron under the grime, where only a maker's eye would ever catch it, was the builder's own cast nameplate, Elias Roan's name and his river iron town raised in the metal, and beneath it the works number the trade had only ever half believed was real, a great one-of-a-kind hammer, the only one of its pattern the man ever finished. And that number matched the entry in the foundry ledger, line for line, and matched the shipping bill made out to the fell forge. Emmett sat down on his shed stool and understood that the headstone the town had laughed at for a month was a rare, complete, one-of-a-kind maker's power hammer by a great forgotten builder, museum-grade to anyone who knew that name, worth a small fortune to a restorer or a working smith, and worth far more than money as the keeper of a lost forge's own papers and the hand of a smith the record. Had struck out. The next morning Emmett did not call a scrapyard, and did not run the frame through the crusher for the iron, and did not cut the machine down into one of those rustic yard ornaments or a novelty anvil lamp for his own shed, and a few in town thought him a fool a second time. He let them. He had spent one whole month being the man who paid $40 for a headstone. And he did not mind being thought a fool by people who had never once been right about the thing in front of them. He carried the cast name plate and the foundry ledger and the letters to a forge and machine museum and smithing guild and to a county archivist who knew what a maker's own foundry record and a struck name meant, and set himself to the harder thing. To strike a forgotten builder's name and a struck-out smith's name back into the record that had dropped them both, and to find what family Ambrose Fell had left. The curator, a woman long among old iron, went very still over the cast plate and said quietly that a documented one-of-a-kind hammer by that builder, its works number matched to his ledger and the shipping bill, was the kind of thing a museum waits a lifetime for, and had all but given up as gone, and that the man who cast it had been no failed country tinkerer at all, but exactly the kind of overlooked master the record is supposed to keep, and had simply lost. And Ambrose Fell had descendants in the country still, a grandson 2 counties over among them, a gray man who had grown up on a scrap of family talk that some old grandfather had had a forge that got tore down and never spoke of it again, a story the family told as an old sadness and mostly let go. Emmett went to him that fall with the letters and the day book open to the last week in that blunt hand, and watched him read his own grandfather's world across the years. The plain, honest account he had set down of the shop the season it was condemned. The man put a hand flat on the table and went quiet. They had grown up thinking their old smith had been shut down under some cloud the family did not name. The ledger and the day book told them instead that he had worked the forge honest to the last week, and been failed only by a trade that could no longer feed a one-man shop and a town that struck his name out with the building. The grandson asked why he had troubled to come so far to give a struck-out stranger's family back their grandfather's name. Emmett said only that a maker casts his name into the iron where the rust will swallow it, because he needs to believe somebody will someday come who can find it, so that being forgotten can never be the same as never having raised the hammer at all, and that he had nobody of his own to leave a thing to, So he had brought the lost forge's record and a struck-out man's own hand home to the people they were always meant for. There was one thing more Emmett did before the hammer left his shed, and he did it for the maker and for the smith and for no one else. He restored it the slow, careful way over a season of nights, cleaned a lifetime of rust and grime from every face of the iron, freed the seized flywheel and the dead ram, trued the worn dies, rebuilt the sprung toggle and the rotted linkage, and set the whole motion right until the great machine would draw up and strike again, dead square the way it had in the forge, not to make a show of it, but because a hammer a great maker had poured his life into deserved to do the one true thing it was made to do. It did not run the frame through the crusher and did not cut the machine down into a yard ornament or a novelty lamp, because using a rare maker's hammer for scrap or a curiosity was the very thing that had nearly killed it, and there was no truth in it. So on the last night, with the museum's people coming in the morning, Emmett set the belt, drew the ram up once, and let it fall, and the great hammer struck, one true square blow ringing off the anvil to the rafters of the little shed, the first the machine had landed in 50 years, and then he stilled it and let it go quiet again. That part was never the point. He had made it whole again so that the man who cast it and the smith whose life it had carried would be heard one time by somebody who finally understood what they were. That fall the hammer went where it belonged, into a forge and machine museum and smithing guild with the maker's name read clear at last and his rare one-of-a-kind machine named beside it. And the fell forger's name was struck back into the county rolls it had been dropped from, and Ambrose Fell's name written in beside it as the smith who beat honest iron under that hammer to the end, generations late, so the family that had thought their old man shut down under a cloud knew at last that he had kept faith to the last week. Word of it went around the town the same as the laughter had, only quieter, and the people who had called Emmett a fool let the name the old man's iron headstone drop and did not pick it up again. Vernon Kellett was not run out of business and was not made a villain. He was simply a man who had laughed loud at a thing he never bothered to look inside. And the next time he held court by the auction table the others did not lean in so far. Being right was the whole of what Emmett had wanted, and it had brought a great forgotten maker's name and a struck-out smith's name back out of the rust. The museum kept the hammer where the town could see it. They stood the great frame square over its anvil in the middle of the front hall under a soft light, the iron cleaned and waxed dark and the dies trued to a soft gray shine, the flywheel free and the motion set and a card beside it showing how the belly of the machine had kept its papers, the rare one-of-a-kind hammer of a great forgotten builder. Cast for a forge that went dark in a hard season and restored to the maker's name at last, and tucked in its base the original foundry ledger and the shipping bill and the day book of the smith, Ambrose Fell, whom the record had struck out and this machine had kept. And on a still evening that next spring, the light going gold through the tall front windows, Emmett Coyle drove over to look in on it, and there in the last of the sun stood the hammer, whole and cleaned, and heard at last the iron glowing soft where a stranger's hands had finally reached it. Emmett was 74 years old, a man the auction had laughed at one whole month, and he stood quiet a long moment and laid one broad scarred hand flat on the cool iron of the frame beside the maker's cast name and nodded once, the way a man nods at a job that was done right. The work had said it for him, the way work always did. A maker casts his own name into the iron the rust will swallow, and a smith tucks a lost forge's papers in the belly of the hammer he beat iron under, trusting somebody will come who can read what their hands made and struck true, so that being forgotten for a lifetime can never be the same as never having raised the hammer at all, and a town rarely knows what greatness or whose good name was left to rust at its own fence line until somebody troubles to open the thing they laughed at. So I'll leave it to you. Was Emmett Coyle right to give the hammer to a museum under the maker's name and carry a struck-out smith's papers home to strangers without keeping any of it for himself? Or was that one decency too far in a world that had laughed at him for nothing? Tell me which one in the comments, and I'll read them.